You are now entering Nick and Melo's hyperspace.
Hello, I'm Carmelo, and I think I'm becoming fascinated by learning more about the Guardians of the Wills as part of the religions of the Force.
And I'm Nick, and I think my favorite part of the Force religions right now might be the Jedi Wayseekers, which are very fun and fascinating.
They're really fascinating. I would be a way seeker.
Me too.
In our journeys through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
And in this episode, we're going to do something a little different. We've not really talked much about like the religious connections in Star Wars, but we're going to talk about how different factions and groups view the Force and how they're, that influences their culture and their kind of their decisions. I think the main one we all know is the Jedi, but there's tons of other groups out there, and we're learning more about them as we've been watching Ahsoka. So we're going to talk about all the
Right.
different factions and going to reference a lot of the stuff from the High Republic. So there's going to be some slight spoilers there, but we won't give too much away.
It is really interesting that for a very long time in Star Wars, you related to the Force either by being a Jedi or a Sith. And one of the things that I have enjoyed about sort of, I don't know, the last decade, probably starting with the television show Clone Wars, it's really fun to see how other people relate to the Force itself. Even things like Mortis in
Yeah,
Clone Wars. It's this really interesting sort of there's some mythology connected to it.
yeah.
And that's been really quite fun. But I think Nick, we should start with the Jedi because they're the big one. You mentioned something to me before the show that I found really like, whoa, interesting, striking, fascinating, scratching my head. And I think it would be fun to start with that.
For those of you that don't know, I grew up in the southeastern part of the United States. Also, for those of you that don't know, this is a big, they call the Bible Belt. This is a very religious part of the country. So that's kind of what made me make the connection watching Star Wars. Even when I was really young, I kind of had an epiphany like, oh, this is kind of how I view the Jedi. I've always thought of the Jedi as, an allegory for Christianity. Um, that's especially in this part of the country, the most dominant religion. Just like in Star Wars, the Jedi have been the most dominant religion, the one we know the
Right.
most about, the ones we see their perspective of. And in Star Wars, we see the Jedi become more influenced by the government and kind of getting their hands in the government, making
Right.
decisions that affect people's lives. And those of you that live in the United States, you can tell religious, I don't want to say fanatics, but that's pretty much what they are. They're
Well,
influencing a
some of
lot of
them are
decisions.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, a lot of
Yes.
religious influence when we're making policies and things that are going to affect lives of everyday citizens. And I've always made that connection that the Jedi are basically Christians of Star Wars. Maybe that's just where my brain went because that's what I was surrounded by. For me, I didn't really learn more about religion until I was older, like different religions, that is. And I went to a Christian university for my undergrad, so that's kind of where I learned more about religion other than Christianity. And in Star Wars, like you said, in the last decade or so, we've kind of learned more about different ways of interpreting the Force through other religious factions.
I find it really interesting what you said about that because you are right that in many ways, in the way that in the United States, Christianity is sort of the establishment religion. The National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. is an Episcopal church. It's not a mosque, it's not a synagogue. And so, in that sense, it is very true that the Jedi Order and the Jedi ethics are sort of parallel to the way that we think of Christianity in the United States. What I find interesting is that when you start looking at the Jedi itself, there is a lot more Eastern philosophy and religion influence than there is Christianity in it. It's really, really fascinating how, when you start studying Taoism from ancient China, when you start looking at Buddhism, which has roots in India and then spreads all over Asia, there are a lot of ideas from those two ways of thinking, because Taoism is not a religion, in the way that the Jedi think about the world, about the Force, about all of those things. I guess religiously, the Force is the Force. The Jedi are not Christians, but you're right that politically and socially, they most certainly are.
Yeah.
They most certainly are. The other thing that I find really interesting about the Force, as viewed from the Jedi, is that there's no superior being, like there's no God.
Mm.
Star Wars in that way is very secular. And so there is a spirituality, there is the connection with nature, there is the notion of the Force, but the Force is not a person.
Right.
The Force is an energy. The Force is something that is everywhere. And so that once again sort of makes it very different from the way that Christians think of their superior being, their spirituality, and their connection with the world that is through God. And so it's really interesting what you're saying, because I had my little blinders about sort of the religious origins of the Jedi, but you're right that the political relationship and the social relationship of the Jedi is equivalent to the way Christianity works and functions in the United States. So you're totally right. I
Well,
just had never thought about that before.
well, also, as you're talking, I'm thinking, when you say that there's no God, but I've always viewed the Force as something like the Holy Spirit. We can't always see it, and it plays a role. And I
Huh.
remember watching a documentary when I was very young, and Lucas, he said his intention for the Force was like an allegory for God, that we never see the Force. We never see it manifested into anything, any being or any object. But he said, that's how I relate to God. Like, just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Uh,
Interesting.
and I always find that fascinating because I have a lot of people of faith. That's why they call it faith. You don't have to have proof. You just have to
Right.
believe. And
Right.
similar to Force,
Right.
you just have to believe in
Right.
yourself and in the world around you. So,
Yeah. No. It's you know why I love these podcasts? Because we have this idea that it's about this big at the beginning, and then we start recording and we start talking with each other.
I think it's
And
so
then
much bigger.
it's bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
It's fascinating.
It's just really awesome. It's just really awesome. The other thing about the Jedi, Nick, that I think is really interesting is it's been really fun seeing the Jedi during the High Republic era versus the Jedi during the Clone Wars era.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Jedi during Phantom Menace and the Clone Wars and all of that, they're sort of very, very strict, very sort of
Mm-hmm.
like set in their ways. Like, this is the way you do it. And one of the things that I have loved and continue to love about the High Republic is that there are different ways of being Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't have to be this very strict way, like it happens with, when Kenobi and Anakin and Mace Windu and all of these are around. But there's a lot more flexibility. In a way, there's less dogmatism in the High Republic era than there is later on. And so it's really interesting of seeing the Jedi a little more relaxed about the ways of doing. And you mentioned the way seekers,
Yeah.
and the way seekers are an excellent example.
Yeah. So, for those of you that don't know, the Wayseekers were introduced in the High Republic. And the idea of a Wayseeker is they're a Jedi that kind of goes on a sabbatical. They don't really follow what the Jedi Order wants them to. They follow the Force. So they go where they're needed. They go where they believe they're meant to be. They're not really, following any kind of strict guidelines or anything. They're just
Right.
way seeking. I guess that's the best way to put it. And you mentioned, in the prequels and the Clone Wars era, the Jedi are very strict and narrow thinking. But in the High Republic, we see that, like you said, they're flexible. And as we're learning through the High Republic and it's coming towards the final phase, that in the beginning, they're not very tied to the Republic. They're not very controlled or influenced by the Republic. And now we're starting to see the seeds planted of, they're being way more involved in politics and the state of the
Yes.
galaxy
Yes.
due to the threats that are coming, and the Republic's kind of relying on them. And I think we're going to start seeing the transition from this is what the Jedi of the Golden Age was.
Yep.
They were very supportive and flexible and appealing to the people. And then by the time we get to the Clone Wars, we see a lot of people that are non-Jedi kind of have a tainted view of what Jedi can be.
Yep.
So,
It's interesting because it's fun in phase 2 of High Republic, which is even further back than phase 1 for the people that haven't read it yet. And if you haven't read it, you have homework to do because you're missing out. You're really
fantastic
missing out.
series.
But it's really interesting because in phase 2, which is the most remote story that we've got so far, it's an era of exploration. So we are seeing Jedi sort of establishing temples and Jedi arriving in places where the Jedi had not been before. when we meet them in the prequel era of the prequel trilogy era, they're the establishment. They're everywhere, and they everybody knows who they are and they knows what they are. But in phase 2 of the High Republic, it's really fun seeing them sort of entering new spaces and connecting with new people and exploring the galaxy along with the Pathfinders and pirates and all of that stuff.
Yes.
And so it's really interesting to see them in the sort of expansion era rather than already being totally established in the way that they're seen by all the members of the galaxy in that way.
I think this is a good transition to talk about the convocation of the Force.
Yes,
That's very prominently featured in the High Republic comics, the ones that Carmelo just mentioned. That series.
That series.
Wonderful series. Only 10 issues, so it's not a big commitment.
Yeah.
Not
it looks really
commitment.
big because I have like every imaginable variant in here.
Right.
Like I have 4 copies of the first one, but it's only 10 issues. It's only 10 issues, and it's really quite well done.
Yeah, very fun for 10 issues, and we get to see the holy city of Jeddah. When we get introduced to it in Rogue One, we hear all these stories about, we know the Guardians of the Wills are there, and Chirrut and Baze, and it seems like a kind of a dying religion by the time Rogue One happens. Oh yeah, look at that for our video
ones
viewers
who are watching the video.
Audio,
that's
you'll
our
have
sort
to,
of introduction to Jeddah on the second or third page of the comic.
They make it feel very holy, like Jerusalem, like a Mecca for different Force users and Force believers. It's really fun seeing the interactions. It feels very biblical a lot of the times to me.
Yeah, you're right, and it's fun because there we get such a variety of ways of thinking of the Force. Once again, in sort of the prequel era, is the Jedi are the religion connected to the Force. Mm-hmm. But in here, there are so many factions and spin-offs and developments that is just really, really, really fun. It was fascinating to read more about the Guardians of the Wills, which we have been hearing since the very first novel of Star Wars that came out 6 months before the movie came out.
Yeah,
because the Guardians of the Wills are the ones that are writing the story. And so it's really interesting to see them as Guardians. They're not Force users, but they believe in the Force, which is once again a really interesting way of thinking about it, because in the prequel era, it was this sort of notion that, if you had the Force, then you were a Jedi. But here you can be part of the Force without necessarily being Force sensitive, and believe in the Force. I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me. It's a line from the Guardians of the Wills, but they're not Force users, which I found absolutely fascinating. And that's just one little element of all the many elements that you get in the High Republic series of Phase 2.
Well, and we've gotten that somewhat in the movies, but they're not big roles. We'll get characters like Lor Santeca, who's a member of the Church of the Force, or Maz Kanata, who's very not in tune with the Force, but a big believer in the Force.
Yes.
So we get minor characters like that, but this really explores kind of the ins and outs of those factions, and it's really cool.
Yes. Well, I mean, and here we get to see what the organization is about, rather than sort of meeting an individual,
right?
Like you were mentioning in the sequel trilogy.
See the whole body of work.
Yes. Yeah. There's something called the Church of the Force. And there's it's just really, really interesting, like the whole explosion of different ways of relating to the Force. And then you get sort of the fundamentalist notion of the Force in the High Republic, which is the Path of the Open Hand, which is a group that believes that using the Force should be prohibited. It's anathema. This is not something that we should do, that we are abusing the Force by using the Force. Now, I'm not going to get into why they believe that, because the mother is one tricky character in the way that she sort of runs and leads and develops the ideas in there. But the truth of the matter is that this is a group that believes that using the Force is abusing it, which is one of the ways that sort of there's this sort of contrast tension between the Jedi Order and other orders and other religions in Jeddah, and the Path of the Open Hand, who is sort of requiring everybody to stop using the Force at all costs. I mentioned this in the panel that Nick and I were at Dragon Con when we were talking about High Republic. But it's really interesting. The Path of the Open Hand in Phase 2, we get to hear about the Elders of the Path in Phase 1 comic series of the High Republic, which are still believing in the idea of we don't use the Force. We do not use the Force. And so even 100 years later, after the events of Phase 2, you still have sort of offshoots of that path that are believing in using the Force is abusing the Force, which is very fundamentalist.
Yeah. Yeah,
Very fundamentalist.
We've never really seen that in Star Wars. We've always kind of seen like the other end, the opposite end, that using the Force kind of leads to corruption and more power, but we've never seen the other end where it's like just stay away from it altogether. Kind of cult turkey.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's very cult like for
a reason. It is very cult like.
Very cult like for a reason, and there's a reason for that.
Absolutely.
Read the books, but I was very intrigued by them from the beginning. They're very terrifying people.
Yes, and there's a group called the Yellow Fellowship. Yellow.
Yeah,
and they seem to be sort of a little connected with the dark side, even though they're Sith.
Right.
So once again, you have that connection in there. And Nick, I don't know how you feel about that. I'm not really including the Sith in here because I don't know that the Sith think of the Force as a religious connection. I see it as more of a source of power.
Yeah.
And so, and maybe some of you that are listening or watching us might have a different idea. But as I was thinking about this episode, I was not thinking of including the Sith in it because they have a very different relationship to the Force from the way the Jedi and the other religions of the High Republic do.
I kind of feel the same way, that they only use the Force for power. I mean, they do meditate and things like that, but it's more for personal gain. It's not about being a part of something bigger.
Yeah.
I guess that brings up an interesting question for me is like the Jedi always talk about, things that lead to the dark side, fear and anger and jealousy, these things. It makes it seem like the Sith are more of I don't want to say an extreme version of Jedi, but maybe like a corrupt offshoot of the Jedi of some kind, more so than like their own identity, if it makes sense to me. That's kind of how I've always viewed it. I don't know how it was in the old canon. The new canon, they have not really touched on the origins of the Sith too much. But that's how I've always viewed it, because I've never seen them as like they don't really have churches of the Sith, or anything like that.
They do have temples, but those temples are not, I just don't think of them as religious temples.
They're more like sanctuaries for them to.
Yeah. This could be my own
thing.
Misconception of my own limitation about thinking about the Sith. But for me, the Jedi have a religious connection to the Force, and I just don't think of the Sith as having a religious connection to the Force.
I don't either.
And so I sort of put them in a separate box. I don't know. I'm scratching my head because I'm thinking, but
they could be
just different for me.
They could be seen similar to the Path of the Open Hand, like as extremists, maybe religious extremists.
Perhaps.
But they don't really do the things in the name of the Force. It's more in the name of yourself. Like I'm doing this for selfish gains rather than a greater power.
Exactly.
So, yeah, they're a tricky one. They don't really. Star Wars.
The Sith are tricky.
I kind of enjoy how Star Wars does not really glamorize the Sith like as a way of life. Most of the Sith characters or Sith adjacent characters that we see are very one, they're troubled people. They're also very their life is not fun. They're suffering. This is not a good way of living. Even the Inquisitors, which I would think is more like a cult or a militia.
A militia, yeah,
more
that's
of a militia.
Good way of thinking about it. Yeah,
they even their existence is terrible. I kind of enjoy how Star Wars just doesn't glamorize the dark side. It's a bad thing and a thing we should really avoid. So
our friend Heather was mentioning in another podcast that we recorded with her a novel called Red Harvest. And the whole idea of the Sith are constantly competing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of community doesn't exist.
Right.
Which to me is fundamental to religion.
Yes.
And so that's why I sort of set it aside from all of these other groups where the Force creates community. With the Sith, it's not about creating community. At least I don't think. I
Well,
know.
and
Prove us wrong, audience. Prove us wrong.
even the relationship that Jedi have with their Padawans, the Master Jedi relationship is
Yeah.
very like mentory,
Hmm. Hmm.
father like or mother like, and then with the Sith, it's more like an abusive relationship rather than I care for this person. It's more of just I'm using you until I can get what I need, or vice versa.
Right. And then I kill you.
All right, there you kill me.
Although it's really interesting now. Now I'm being like, I'm going to put my cynical hat. The Sith can only have two, a master
Well,
and an apprentice, but the Jedi
there's
cannot
thousands.
have more than one. So it's a master and an apprentice. It's a Padawan and a Jedi Knight, or a master and a Padawan. So it's really interesting that even though the relationships are completely different, you still have that one-on-one
That's true. That's true.
in both relationships. So I think it's time to talk about the Night Sisters, which
Oh
I
yeah,
have
yeah.
right there. I just bought some miniatures of Mother Talzin, and I'm really excited about those. But the Night Sisters are another fascinating offshoot because they don't even call it the Force.
No, they just call it magic.
They call it magic with a K. Um, and
The,
but it
that's
is
that's
but
potassium.
it is sort of yet another way of thinking about this sort of energy that exists everywhere, but the Night Sisters are sort of drawing from it in a very different way.
I've loved that we've gotten more of the Night Sisters with Ahsoka, and we're kind of learning about where they come from and their origins a bit. Um, they're very. I've always wondered. I think a lot of times people ask, "Is are the Night Sisters using the Force, or is there magic in Star Wars?" And I've kind of gone back and forth. Like,
Mm,
I don't really know if magic per se. I think it maybe just be all the Force, maybe just a different aspect of the Force.
that's the way I think about it.
That's how I always thought about it. But it is interesting how not really any other religious faction that we've ever come across in Star Wars uses like spells. It's just using the Force to do certain things or certain feats. I don't know. I would love to see. We've gotten a little bit of like some Night Sister characters. We've never really seen a full story of like a Night Sister's perspective on how they view the
Right,
Force and
right, right.
how being a Night Sister affects their daily lives. I would love to see just a POV story of a Night Sister.
You mentioned something really interesting that I had not thought about before. The whole idea of spells.
Mhm.
It's very Night Sisters.
Yeah.
I always talk about Star Wars only being fictionally far, far away, and that the way the story is told and the elements of the story are very much connected to our world outside of Star Wars. In Ahsoka, they kept calling the Night Sister witches. Balin and Shin, Shin is sort of like, oh, more witches.
Yeah. That's true.
And so it's really interesting that that whole, I'm going to call it a prejudice, the prejudice against the idea of sorcery in the way that we think of witches, in at least in the West, is sort of transferred in Star Wars of Balin and Shin thinking about the Night Sisters as this is witchcraft, this is sorcery, this
Yeah.
is not using the Force, but it is using an energy that is extrasensorial sensorial energy. It's just really interesting to think of them as sort of a parallel way of relating to the Force that very much connects with the sort of prejudice notion of witchcraft. They're the pagan ones. They really
Yeah.
are the pagan ones. Um,
I
unlike the Jedi. Unlike the
you
Jedi.
now that you're saying that, there have been a couple instances now that I'm thinking, um, where like people that are not really don't have any knowledge of the Force or don't really know anything about the Jedi, they've called Jedi wizards. They like Uncle Owen in A New Hope says he's just a crazy old wizard.
Right.
So like
Right.
I don't know if that's just like
No, 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 no.
a
That's part
term.
of that language. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of it's a term that they just kind of came up with, or if that's like an old term that people when the first was maybe we'll learn that in the James Mangold movie that when people first start harnessing the Force and
Mm.
utilizing the Force, they like, oh, that's some kind of wizardry or something,
Right. Right.
instead of not knowing it's a part of energy field that binds everyone together. Who knows?
And this is the thing when you don't believe it's magic.
Mm,
When you don't believe it's wizardry. When you don't believe it's
witchcraft.
witchcraft.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that Uncle Owen, who does not understand the Force the way that others do, thinks of Kenobi as a wizard. We know the Jedi, so we don't think of it as wizardry because for us it's real.
Yeah.
Because for us, the Force is there, and a Force-sensitive person is able to use the Force. If you're a Jedi, for the good. If you're a Sith, for yourself. And so it's really interesting how the perspective of how that energy relates to you and relates to others creates a positive or a negative rendition of who these people are. The Nightsisters have always been fascinating to me because they're not Sith, but they're not Jedi. They're just their own. They're their own thing. And the whole Western prejudice of women and witchcraft, it's sort of distilled into the notion of the Nightsisters with all its contradictions, for better or for worse.
I wanted to bring up, so I not really into video games anymore as I've gotten older. I did play the first Jedi Fallen Order game. And the game, there's you go through a lot of ancient ruins of a force-sensitive civilization called the Zepho. And they were...
Right, you mentioned that. Yes.
They were from a galaxy far off, or a different galaxy. They didn't really specify. This was 4 or 5 years ago when they made this game, so they could have known that like this is what we're doing with Ahsoka, or it could just be a coincidence.
Right.
But in that game, you deal with a lot of Night Sister magic, and there's one of the prominent characters in that game is a Night Sister, and there's the Zepho. You go through and you learn that ancient force sensitive people, they kind of got corrupted with power by the dark side, and they kind of ruined their civilization, fell apart because of it, and most of their history is kind of unknown. But they're from a different galaxy, and as I haven't played the latest game, so I don't quite know what happens follows up. But from what I've heard, there's kind of a connection between the Zepho and the Night Sisters, and it makes me think maybe the Zepho, just like the Night Sister, from a different galaxy. And maybe I hope one day, maybe or in the future, we get like stories, maybe books, comics, maybe shows about that other galaxy and kind of different religious factions and how witchcraft, just all kinds of things about how the Force is used. I would love to see more that unexplored galaxy, because it's kind of similar to, like I said earlier, in this country, Christianity is the prominent religion, but people that are unfamiliar with Middle Eastern cultures or Asian cultures, that's very foreign to them, and kind of how it would be, in the Star Wars galaxy. That other galaxy is very foreign, and we don't know anything about it. So that's kind of how, when I was a kid, when I first learned what paganism was, and I was kind of not like follower of paganism, but I was just interested. What is this thing I've never heard of?
Right.
My family was very like surprised, like, oh my God, he's learning about paganism.
Yeah.
He's going to be a witch or something. I don't know. But I was just
the wizard.
Yeah.
I love that idea. This was awesome. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, audience. Yeah. As we have mentioned before, make sure you like our videos if you enjoy what we have been talking about.
Please do.
And definitely subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you can get notifications when we post more shows, more episodes. This season 3 has been really fun.
We've touched on a lot of interesting topics.
It's been fun. We're in our third season, Nick. We're in our
That's crazy. That is crazy. Oh, and we got some more interesting topics coming up, and we're just stay tuned. I'm very excited.
Enjoy, guys. May the Force be with you.
Goodbye.